On today's edition of the show, we discuss how the Florida Panthers were out-hustled and outplayed on Friday night at FLA Live Arena, where the Boston Bruins came out to a 4-0 lead, and the Panthers made a little bit of a push, but it was too little too late. We talk about the defensive debt now for the Florida Panthers, and are we talking about a goalie change come Game 4?
You're Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into this special Saturday, April 22nd edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We're your team every day. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. I'm Armando Velez, and you can follow me on Twitter at Monoman12. Follow the show account on Twitter and Instagram at LO_FLA Panthers. Don't forget to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and shout out to the everydayers who make Locked On Panthers your first listen of the day. We are free and available on all platforms and on YouTube. So the Florida Panthers, they were welcomed back home on Friday night to a raucous crowd at FLA Live Arena. There was, going into Friday night's game, I was pretty confident with this Panthers team, especially knowing that Patrice Bergeron wasn't making the trip. David Krejci was a late scratch for the Boston Bruins, so this was the perfect time to take advantage of this series, especially being at home and having the last change. But the Florida Panthers just came out flat in Game 3 of this 7-game series, and now with the 4-2 loss against the Boston Bruins, Boston has home ice advantage back. They look like the team that they looked like in Game 1. And the Panthers have more questions than they do answers. And this will be a great time to welcome in my guest on the show today. He is a familiar face and voice in the South Florida community. He's a former host / producer for the Florida Panthers and the Marlins on Fox Sports Florida. He is Frank Forte. Frank, welcome to Locked On Panthers.
Good morning, Armando. How you doing?
I am doing well. Thank you for joining me on this Saturday morning, and I'm glad that we decided to do a morning podcast on a Saturday and give a little bit of time to digest the loss for the Florida Panthers on Friday night. And like I said at the top, this team came out absolutely flat, and
I'm going to take issue with you there.
Okay.
I thought the first period was fine.
Mm-hmm.
Second period,
yes,
all the air came out of the tires in the second period.
Mm-hmm.
I thought they played pretty even. They've got to have that save from Lyon on the Taylor Hall goal in the playoffs. And we all love what Alex Lyon's done. But the truth of the matter is he's given up a soft goal in each of the 3 games. And granted, Game 2 was irrelevant. It was late with a minute and change left. But
Mm-hmm.
Did they have the opportunity to do more in the first period? Certainly. But I didn't think they played poorly in the first period. Was it great? No. I just wouldn't quite characterize it as flat. I totally agree in the second period.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody punctured the tires.
Yeah, and with that, with the physicality was starting to pick up a little bit early on, and I thought that Anthony Duclair, even in the first period, that he was starting to look great as well. He was retrieving pucks and stopping the Boston Bruins from clearing, great on the forecheck as well. The Florida Panthers power play, they had 3 shots on goal in that first one, and you're right. That's 3 games where the Boston Bruins find a way to score a goal that you kind of raise your eyebrow a little bit when it comes to Alex Lyon. The Boston Bruins know that they can score glove side on Alex Lyon. That they have seen enough of a sample size in this series that they know that they could go to Alex Lyon on the glove side. But going to the second period, like you referred, 4 shots on goal in the second period, and the Panthers were struggling with their breakouts, passes in the middle of the ice that were intercepted, board battles that were lost. I mean, let's talk about the second goal that kind of took the air out of the building. I mean, Anthony Duclair loses a board battle to Brad Marchand, and then Charlie Coyle outmuscles Alexander Barkov to get in front of the net. And like you said, the air of the balloon coming out for the Florida Panthers. And what did you think? What did you think about the Boston Bruins just getting in their faces and being quick to pucks versus the Florida Panthers?
Well, look, and I said this last night on Twitter. There's a reason the Bruins won 62 games. Correct, they don't have Bergeron. Krejci was a late scratch. But I kind of look at it this way. Pastrnak is a better forward than anybody the Panthers have.
Correct.
Would you agree with that?
61 goals says something.
Okay. Charlie McAvoy is a better defenseman than anyone the Panthers have overall game.
Don't disagree.
Okay. Linus Ullmark is better than the Panthers goalies. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you start with those 3. It's still a deep Boston team. You look at the moves they made at the deadline. And look, I dislike Boston as much as anybody down here. But I give Don Sweeney credit because he made some terrific moves at the trade deadline. I mean, Tyler Bertuzzi is a playoff type player.
He's a grinder.
Okay? He's a pest. He's got a little bit of skill, right? Dmitry Orlov's a top 4 defenseman on pretty much any team in the league. And for whatever reason, Washington moved on from him. So they're still a deep team. I look at it this way. You know, a lot of fans were saying, well, the Panthers' effort last night was horrendous, this and that. And I don't totally disagree with that, but they got Boston. Boston won 62 games for a reason. And again, I realize they're missing 2 top players, but they're still a very, very deep team. I mean, look at the guys that you know they brought into the lineup with those 2 out. They're still pretty good players. So, you know, I had 0 expectations coming into this series. If you follow me on Twitter, I said, look, it was such a grind to get in. It was such a disappointing regular season overall until the last couple of weeks. So I have 0 expectations. I just didn't want to be the team that went from President's Cup to out of the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
I did not want that hanging around the franchise's neck with so much other baggage they have from the past. So I had no expectations from this series. I was thrilled that they got out of Boston 1-1, but I really thought either game 3 or game 4 would be what last night was, that Boston would be Boston. And, you know, you got to give them credit. They shut it down in the second period. They choked the life out of the Panthers, as you mentioned, on the breakouts and in the neutral zone. You know, the Panthers just couldn't get anything going. So while I'm disappointed, I'm not surprised in the least bit. And again, had 0 expectations for this series.
Yeah, and it would have been foolish of me to expect the Florida Panthers to have a sweep in this part of the series in games 3 and 4 with how the Boston Bruins have looked all season. And I've been singing Brendan Montour's praise this season. Of course, the single season record for points for defensemen, but last night wasn't his best night. Shortly after the goal that went the Boston Bruins up 2-0, a little bit loose in the neutral zone, and credit to Ryan Lomberg on the back check on the 2-0 that stopped the Boston Bruins from it being 3-0 at the time. And it was and then later on the Pastrnak goal. I mean, the Florida Panthers, they haven't been bitten by David Pastrnak as much as I thought they would. Their line has been great at tracking David Pastrnak on the one-timers, but also there have been plenty of times that we see Pasta miss the net as well. There's no denying that. But Brandon Montour, where there wasn't a shift change. In the Panthers in the Boston zone, it's not the period where you have that long change neither. And Brandon Montour just lets David Pastrnak, not lets him, but loses him.
Mhm.
And David Pastrnak goes on a breakaway to make it 3-0 at the time. What did you think of Brandon Montour's performance on Friday night?
Not good. Having said that, he turned into a Panther star this season.
Yes.
For a guy they get for a third round pick, an absolute steal. Borderline all-star. A lot of people thought he should have been in the all-star game, but
Yeah.
again, I don't think the Atlantic Division had a defenseman on their roster in the all-star game, at least not to start off with, if I recall correctly. But I'm digressing there. He had a fantastic season. He's been a rock for the Panthers, but he had a rough night last night. I mean, there's no other way to put it, and that can happen. It can happen to anybody. And last night was not his night. The third goal for Boston, the breakaway, was he because of it was he and Forsling out there who don't usually play together. Obviously there were some injury factors there, and it was really 1-on-2 in the Panthers half of the neutral zone. And I think there was sort of a miscommunication there, or a misunderstanding is probably a better word, as to who was going to pick him up and who was going to maybe drop back and support. And both guys wound up doing neither. And, Pasta split him and goes in and scores. So, he and Forsling just got caught on that one. And I think not playing together for much of the last half of the season, I think there was kind of a misunderstanding there. But, as great as Montour's been, he had a rough night last night. And of course, for people like us who watch the games and comment on the games, everything gets magnified in the playoffs.
Absolutely.
So, we're picking apart this and we're picking apart that. But that's just the way the playoffs are, you know?
And yeah, it's a little bit magnified more, but it doesn't take away the great season that Brandon Montour has had. But we're going to transition over to segment number 2, where we're going to discuss more of the Panthers and their attempt to come back, talk about more of their injuries that happened in Game 3, and discuss more about the changes that Paul Maurice made in mid-game. We're going to discuss that next here on the show. But first, we're going to tell you all about eBay Motors. And for a championship team, it's about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you fit is right the first time around. Just add your ride to my garage and look at the green check to know the part will fit, or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop at eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices at ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Segment number 2 here on this Saturday, April 22nd edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Thankful to have former host and producer of the Florida Panthers and the Marlins from Fox Sports Florida, Frank Forte. And Frank, the Florida Panthers, by 11:45 of the third period, Taylor Hall goes up the right wing wall, centers it to Nick Foligno. And, well, before that, Sergei Bobrovsky was inserted into the game for Alex Line after the third goal. And Taylor Hall gets it to Nick Foligno, who was going to be scratched in this game if it weren't for the injuries of the Boston Bruins. But also after that, this is where the Panthers started to wake up. I mean, prior to the third period, Alexander Barkov only had one shot on goal through 8 periods of play. Yeah. In the third period last night, he had 3 of them. And really what jump-started Alexander Barkov and getting shots on net was the hit that Charlie McAvoy had on Anton Lundell, which was clean. It was a clean hit by McAvoy. But, of course, really any big hit in hockey that a player is threatened to get hurt, the culture is stand up for your guy. So I kind of understand that. The Panthers Didn't help that they went to the box after being down 4-0. Brandon Montour gets a misconduct. Tyler Bertuzzi gets a misconduct. So you're down one defenseman there for Montour. Earlier, Aaron Ekblad tries to have a hit in the Boston zone, and Aaron Ekblad knocks himself out. Tries coming back to the game, and then the Panthers had to juggle with 5 defensemen later. Then later, Josh Mahura exits the game too. So to make matters worse, the defensive depth for the Panthers is being tested. And you even said the statement at the top of the show: who has the better goalie? Boston. Who has the better number 1 defenseman? Boston. Who has the better center depth? Boston. And when you're down 3 defensemen, when it's already the thinnest part of your roster, it was a tough hill to come back from. I mean, I know we've talked about comeback cats over the last 2 seasons, and the Florida Panthers did have a shorthanded goal and one on a 6-on-5. And the worst part is this was a wasted opportunity for the Panthers as they went 4 for 4 on the penalty kill too.
Yeah.
That's the worst part about it, Frank.
And the special teams, I said it early in the series, in the playoffs, the special teams are so important because the 5-on-5 really tightens up. And, they don't have a power play goal.
0 for 7.
As you said, what's that? I'm sorry.
0 for 7 on the power play in the series.
Yeah. They don't have a power play goal. And, they did get to Shorty last night. And I don't think, you can say garbage goals or garbage time goals, which is fine. They didn't affect the outcome. But I do think for their state of mind, it was important that they had a little pushback there, going into game 4. You can at least feel like for most of this series, for 75% of this series, they can say to themselves, look, we can play with these guys. Now, that 25% has been pretty tilted in Boston's favor.
Yeah.
But I think it was important that they did get those 2 goals last night, just so they go into game 4 feeling like, yeah, we can still play with them when we give our best effort and when we're playing smart. And and again, I might be digressing a little bit here, Armando, but for the Panthers to have a shot in this series, I think everything needed to go right for them, or everything needs to go right for them. They've got to get the saves that you expect. They can't be turning pucks over. They have to have a little bit of puck luck. They can't be taking unnecessary penalties as they have throughout so much of this season. The stick fouls, how frustrating was that throughout the course of the season? So everything has to go right, in my opinion, given the gap between these 2 teams in the regular season, as the standings showed. And so far, some things have gone right, and some things haven't. So that's why we are where we are at 2-1. And but I think getting those 2 late goals at least gives them the idea that, look, we're not like super behind the 8 ball going into game 4.
It's a sense of pride. That's what it comes down to.
You don't want to see a team roll over, which would have been pretty easy to do at 4-0. The fact that it was a shorthanded goal shows that, the effort, the want to, was still there at that point in the game.
Yeah, and even before, even when Lomberg took that penalty in the 3rd period at 9:35, the Panthers were starting to get their shorthanded chances before it even became 4-0. But also, here's the thing: you talked about giveaways. The Panthers only had 5 giveaways in all of game 2.
Right.
They had 9 in period 2 alone.
Yeah.
On Friday night. That's recipe for disaster. That's why you see 4 shots on goal for the Panthers there, where honestly the game was won and lost in that period of time for the Panthers. And that's just taking care of the puck. That's really what it comes down to. And you talked about, I liked what you said, a game that you have to play almost perfect against this team, and you have to do it 4 times. They in game 2 they were able to get to the slot more often, but you also think about this: the Boston Bruins were forcing the Panthers to the outside. 62 shot attempts, 31 made it on net. So half of them are missing or being blocked, especially when the Florida Panthers are shooting it from the point as well. The Boston Bruins are in position to block shots.
If I can go back to the first period when you mentioned that, and look, Sasha Barkov's come in for a lot of criticism in this series, and rightfully so. We need more out of the guy. But do you remember in the first period when he grabbed that loose puck in the slot and had a golden scoring chance, and Nosek made an unbelievable block on that shot? And, that might have put the Panthers on the right path if that puck goes in. So that was a huge, in my opinion, that was a huge shot block by the Boston Bruins. Look, I'm as big a Sasha Barkov fan as anybody around. And I don't think the numbers are as bad as people would make it out to be. He's got 23 points in 29 playoff games, but only 3 goals in his last 21. And you mentioned when he, jumped in defense of a teammate. I like pissed off Barkov. I wish we had more pissed off Barkov, especially in the playoffs. I think we would all agree that as talented as he is and as important as he is to this team, he doesn't especially play a heavy game. Now, you see it sometimes when he's protecting the puck because he's great at that. But, getting out, as you mentioned, getting out battled by Coyle on the second goal. I mean, he's a big dude. He's got to win that battle in front. And Sasha, I've known him since he was drafted by the Panthers. I had the privilege of, having cameras in the meeting room when they interviewed Barkov the day before the draft in New Jersey in 2013. And of course, I interviewed him right after they picked him. So I've been around this guy for a long time, and he's not the rah-rah in your face, type of leader. He's got to lead by example. And unfortunately, that just hasn't happened so far in this series. He does have 2 points, but they're both secondary assists. He hasn't had the impact that you need a player of his stature to have. And again, I'm just being real. I'm a huge Barkov fan. He's a foundational piece of this franchise. I want him in this uniform till his playing days are done. But I think we would all agree that we need more out of 16.
Absolutely. Need more out of 16 now with the 3 shots on goal in the third period of Friday night's game. That's 4 shots on goal. Like you said, 2 points for Sasha Barkov, secondary assist in the series. But we're going to transition over to segment number 3. We're going to discuss more about Game 4 upcoming, and we're going to ask the question: should the Florida Panthers put Sergei Bobrovsky between the pipes in Game 4? We're going to discuss that next here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast.
Your Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Third and final segment here on this special Saturday, April 22nd edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Thank you so much for making Locked On Panthers your first listen of the day. And shout out to the everydayers who come back to get your Florida Panthers fix. On Sunday night, we will be providing you a post-game reaction to Game 4 with Alex Slent from Full Press Hockey. So make sure to come back Sunday to get the post-game reaction from myself and Alex Slent. But still here with Frank Forte, former host / producer for the Florida Panthers and Marlins on Fox Sports Florida. And Frank, of course, we saw the line changes for Paul Maurice in Game 3. The Barkov, Etulis Thorinen line and Sam Reinhart line 5 minutes and 15 seconds at 5-on-5, 0 shots for to 5 shots against on the night. And a little bit of a lines put it in the blender here as Etu and Lundell switch spots. Etu going back to that third line center. Of course, we know he's used to playing center. That's his natural position. Lundell going on Barkov's wing. But we also saw how Barkov and Lundell during the regular season, that pairing kind of plateaued in the middle of the season. Of course, Duke, it's been a little bit to get his legs back as far as coming back from the injury.
And I think that's a big factor. If I could step in there, he hasn't looked anything like the player that he was last year. And it's kind of understandable coming off that type of injury. But again, this is a guy you were counting on big time this year. And he had the very bad turnover in game 2, which again, didn't affect the final outcome. But he didn't get back on the last goal last night. He got beat to the net. And, that's when you talk about depth, the Panthers aren't getting out of Duclair what they hoped they would get when he came back from the injury. And again, it's been a slow process for him. And, maybe next year it'll be different. Maybe he'll be back to the guy we saw last year. We certainly hope so. But again, you need everybody on board. Everybody's got to be playing their role to the absolute max to beat this Boston team. And I don't mean to pick on Duclair. There's plenty of guys that, can fall into that category. But that's just one example, if I can say that.
Yeah, and Duclair being beat by Nick Foligno on that goal, getting right behind where Bobrovsky was beat on the backhand right in front. And yeah, it's been a little bit tough for Duclair to get going since coming back from injury. But also, we've been asking this question for weeks with Alex Lyon on that 6-game winning streak to end the regular season. Well, before the Florida Panthers went 0-1-1 in their last 2, but still squeaked in. And Alex Lyon has been a wonderful story, but we have seen in this series that he's given up that goal, that eyebrow-raising goal. Yeah. And with Bobrovsky coming in, of course, this was seen as kind of like a mercy type of pull that you don't necessarily put the whole game on Alex Lyon, but you're paying $10 million to Sergei Bobrovsky in AAV, and of course he let in that goal by Foligno, but now the Panthers lost home ice in this series. I don't know. I'm not sure, Frank, but I'm not sure if I go back to Sergei Bobrovsky in game 4. I know Lyon has given up the questionable goals, but I just think with how Lyon has been able to get on the top of the crease and taking away the angles of the Boston Bruins, especially being lined up and having eyes on the back of his head with Pastrnak. I'm very impressed with how he's been able to track David Pastrnak. Yeah. I don't know if I'd go to Sergei Bobrovsky for game 4. I'm part of me says that the Florida Panthers should go back to Alex Lyon, but of course there's pride on the line with what you're paying Sergei Bobrovsky.
Yeah. Well, I think, and this isn't necessarily my opinion alone, because I was listening to NHL radio yesterday morning, and one of the analysts said he gives Paul Maurice a lot of credit for having the nerve to go back to Lyon in game 2, when it would have been pretty easy to make a switch at that point. And it paid off. I think, I don't know if so much of a mercy pull, but if you're thinking about playing Bobrovsky in this series, that was the right time to get him in there and get him some minutes. He hasn't played in how many weeks?
3.
Yeah.
Somewhere around there.
Well, if you're thinking about using him in the series, isn't it better to get him in the game last night rather than throwing him in at the start of game 4 or game 5? Totally not having played for the past 3+ weeks. So I think Paul Maurice today is thinking long and hard about whether he goes to Bobrovsky. I think Alex Lyon is going to live forever in Panthers lore for what he did, at least in the minds of the fans. He's not getting a statue outside the building, but in the minds of the fans, he's going to live a long time in Panthers lore for what he did getting them into the playoffs. And it's a great story for a 30-year-old, basically career AHL guy, which, by the way, it's hard to have a long career in professional hockey, whether it's the NHL or the AHL. That's very hard to do. But maybe some of the magic has run out of the lantern, if it were. The genie's not popping out anymore. I'm leaning toward going with Bobrovsky in Game 4, and it's not a hard lean, but it's maybe 55%, 45%. I just think a little bit of the magic has run out,
and that could be that could be why you make that move too. Is it a dangerous game to play to try to get a spark? Absolutely.
But at this point, you're down 2-1 to the team that was the best team in the league, right? So, is it a dangerous move? Yeah, but I mean, at this point, you're thinking, what do we really have to lose? So, and again, it's just it's a gut feeling. Lions made a bunch of terrific saves in this series, but he's also let in 3 that you would think he would stop, given those other saves. So I'm a soft lean toward going with Bob in Game 4.
Yeah, and
as much as the fan base doesn't trust him for the most part.
Sometimes those stretches of good play, even prior to the game against the Chicago Blackhawks, you're like, "There's the Vezina Bob that we've been."
Well, before he got sick, he was really playing well, and he was keeping them in the race. But again, he's had a very up and down year, as a lot of guys have.
Yeah, and let's not be surprised if the Florida Panthers do, in fact, go to Sergei Bobrovsky in Game 4, and that might be the spark that they need to tie the series and at least guarantee a Game 6 for the Florida Panthers versus the Boston Bruins. A little bit of a update on the farm for the Florida Panthers. The Charlotte Checkers win Game 3 by a final score of 6-0 at Bojangles Coliseum. Connor Bunneman, former Flyers prospect, part of the Claude Giroux trade, scores 2 goals on the night, and JF Berube posts a shutout for the Charlotte Checkers. He came in Game 1, didn't allow a goal the rest of the way. Matt Guza got the win in Game 2, and JF Berube got the win in Game 3. And the Charlotte Checkers will be advancing to the second round, where they will face the Hershey Bears, where first 2 games in Charlotte and then the rest of the way in Hershey, PA. As the Florida Panthers affiliate will be facing off against the Washington Capitals affiliate in round number 2 in the Calder Cup playoffs. But Frank, I want to thank you so much for joining me on this Saturday edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Great for you to have your debut here, and great seeing you on the Twitter, just whether it's a rant or whether it's just speaking truth about this Florida Panthers team. I want to thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Hey, Armando, if I can, you mentioned, back on Fox Sports Florida, now Bally Sports Florida. I know you're an FIU graduate. I now work at Florida Atlantic University, and we do have a television show on Bally on Thursdays and Saturdays at 11:30 in the morning. It'll be on for another month. We take a break during the summer, and we come back with football in mid-August. So you can still see me on TV, but not as often as you used to. So I appreciate the opportunity to come on with you and get a little plug in for our Inside the Owls Burrow show.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Frank. And you guys can follow Frank on Twitter at Frank J. Fort on Twitter, where you'll see him post regularly about Panthers, Marlins, everything FAU Owls on the Twitter, and again, Thursdays and Saturdays at 11:30 a.m. on Bally Sports Florida. So thank you so much, Frank, and I hope to see you next time.
Armando, might see you at Game 4.
I will be there.
All right.
See you, Frank.
Have a good one.
And if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to the podcast to be notified every single time the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast jumps into your podcast feed. Don't forget to subscribe to the other shows on the Locked On NHL Network, including Locked On NHL, Locked On Fantasy Hockey with Flip Livingstone and Stu Roden, and Locked On NHL Prospects. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. And for you everydayers, make sure you come back Sunday night here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. We'll be breaking down Game 4 between the Florida Panthers and the Boston Bruins with Alex Slemp of Full Press NHL. So make sure to come back then. So I'm Armando Velez with Frank Forte. And you've been listening to Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day.